It's now been 10 years since Moscow illegally annexed Crimea. The occupation followed an invasion where
Country now being directly involved in fighting Ukrainian government forces.
Satellite imagery show Russian combat units southeast. Imagine waking up one morning to find your streets filled with foreign soldiers, military vehicles rolling past your window, and the once familiar landscape now under siege. This was the unsettling reality for the people of Crimea in February 2014. In a matter of days, this peaceful Black Sea peninsula, known for its picturesque views and historical significance, became the focal point of an international crisis. Russian forces swiftly moved in, triggering outrage and condemnation from governments around the world. What appeared to be a sudden military intervention to protect Russian-speaking citizens, however, may have been the product of a far deeper, long-term geopolitical strategy. Today, we delve into the untold story of the 2014 Crimea invasion, exploring real footage, key events, and the critical elements often overlooked in mainstream discussions. The prelude to invasion. The roots of Russia's military actions in Crimea stretch back decades, fueled by complex historical, cultural, and political dynamics between Russia and Ukraine. To truly understand why Russia moved so swiftly and decisively in 2014, we must first examine the broader geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has found itself caught between two competing forces: its historical ties to Russia and the growing influence of the West. The 2004 Orange Revolution was a significant turning point, as Ukrainians took to the streets in protest against government corruption and electoral fraud, pushing the country closer to European integration. This shift was perceived by Russia as a direct challenge to its sphere of influence, heightening Moscow's fears of losing control over its former Soviet territories. In the years that followed, Ukraine remained a battleground of competing political forces. The 2013 to 2014 Euromaidan protests, which erupted in response to President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia, were another flashpoint. The decision to move toward Russia sparked widespread protests, and in February 2014, these protests escalated into violent clashes, forcing Yanukovych to flee the country. This created a power vacuum in Ukraine, and the pro-Western interim government that took control alarmed Moscow. According to political analyst Taras Kuzio, 2014, the Kremlin viewed this as a Western-backed coup. However, Moscow's fears went beyond politics. The Euromaidan revolution signaled a potential loss of cultural influence as Ukraine gravitated toward Western values and institutions and economic influence, given the strategic importance of Ukraine's markets and pipelines for Russian energy exports. These combined fears, political, cultural, and economic, shaped the Kremlin's perception of the events as a multifaceted threat to its interests, particularly in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Russia's strategic move, February 2014. By February 2014, the political crisis in Ukraine had reached its zenith. The ousting of President Yanukovych created instability, and Russia quickly moved to secure its interests, particularly in Crimea, a region with a significant Russian-speaking population. Crimea's strategic importance to Russia cannot be overstated. The Black Sea Fleet, stationed in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol, was critical to Russia's naval and military strategy in the region, providing access to vital sea routes. As Goetz, 2022 points out, Crimea was a symbol of Russia's military power in the Black Sea, and losing control over the peninsula would have represented a severe blow to Russian influence in the region. On February 27, 2014, the first signs of Russia's intervention were seen when armed men in unmarked uniforms, later identified as Russian soldiers, took control of key government buildings in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. These soldiers, known as the Little Green Men, were highly organized, well-equipped, and strategically positioned, signaling the beginning of Russia's de facto control over the peninsula. This operation was a textbook example of hybrid warfare, blending traditional military power with psychological tactics, cyber warfare, and disinformation to achieve strategic objectives without a formal declaration of war. On March 1, 2014, Russian President Vladimir Putin made his move move official, requesting and receiving approval from the Russian parliament to use military force in Ukraine. Putin justified the intervention as a necessary response to protect the rights of Russian-speaking citizens in Crimea and southeastern Ukraine, claiming that the interim government in Kiev posed a direct threat to ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. According to Arbatov, 2022, this intervention was part of a broader Russian strategy to reassert its dominance in the post-Soviet space, particularly as NATO continued to expand eastward. The annexation of Crimea, therefore, was not just about protecting Russian citizens, but also about preventing further Western encroachment into what Russia considered its sphere of influence. The referendum and annexation, a new reality for Crimea. As Russian forces solidified their presence in Crimea, a controversial referendum was organized on March 16, 2014, to decide the region's future. The official results claimed an overwhelming 96.7% of voters supported joining Russia. However, the legitimacy of this referendum was immediately questioned. The presence of Russian troops, the absence of international monitors, and reports of voter intimidation raised serious doubts about the credibility of the vote. According to Beckley, 2022, the West viewed the referendum as a direct violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which led to widespread condemnation from the international community. On March 18, 2014, just 2 days after the referendum, Putin signed a treaty that formally annexed Crimea into the Russian Federation. This rapid annexation caught the world off guard, with many countries expressing shock and outrage, while some, like Goetz, 2022, framed this move as a response to NATO's growing influence in Eastern Europe. Others argue that Russia's actions were deeply rooted in domestic politics and historical ambitions. For instance, the annexation was seen as a way for Putin to consolidate power internally, boost nationalistic sentiment, and reaffirm Russia's historical ties to Crimea. By challenging the post-World War II international order that emphasized sovereign borders and peaceful conflict resolution, Russia's actions reflected a complex mix of strategic, historical, and political motivations. The hybrid warfare approach, redefining modern conflict. One of the most significant aspects of the Crimea invasion was Russia's use of hybrid warfare, a term that has since become a key concept in modern conflict. Unlike traditional military invasions, hybrid warfare involves a combination of conventional military tactics, irregular troops, cyber attacks, and information warfare. Modal, 2015, highlights how Russia flooded social media and news channels with propaganda, portraying the invasion as a liberation effort aimed at protecting ethnic Russians from Ukrainian fascists. This narrative was carefully crafted to sway public opinion, both within Russia and abroad, allowing the Kremlin to justify its actions while obfuscating the true intentions behind the invasion. The effectiveness of Russia's hybrid warfare strategy cannot be overstated. By the time Western governments had even begun to react, Russia had already established full control over Crimea, avoiding the prolonged combat and high casualties typically associated with military invasions. However, this strategy did not come without its own set of consequences. While Russia may have achieved its immediate objectives with relative speed, the invasion led to protracted tensions and significant long-term instability, particularly in Ukraine and across the broader region. The annexation sparked a years-long conflict in eastern Ukraine and escalated geopolitical tensions, undermining regional security and challenging the international order. This new model of warfare has since been adopted in other conflicts, raising important questions about the future of international diplomacy and military strategy. Economic warfare, sanctions, and countermeasures. In the wake of Crimea's annexation, the United States, the European Union, and other Western nations responded by imposing a series of harsh economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, including its banking, energy, and defense industries. The goal was to cripple Russia's economy and force it to reverse its actions in Crimea. However, instead of backing down, Russia responded by strengthening its economic ties with China and other non-Western countries, showcasing its resilience in the face of Western pressure. This shift toward the east allowed Russia to weather the economic storm and mitigate the impact of sanctions, illustrating the limits of Western influence in the face of a determined adversary. The international fallout, a new Cold War, the annexation of Crimea sent shockwaves through the international community, leading many analysts to speculate that the world was witnessing the dawn of of a new Cold War. While the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, with 100 nations voting in favor and only 11 against, this symbolic gesture did little to alter the situation on the ground. However, framing the situation solely as a new Cold War may oversimplify the complex global dynamics at play. As Arbatov, 2022 suggests, the Crimea crisis exposed deep fractures in the international system, revealing the limitations of global governance and the failure of institutions like the UN to enforce international law effectively. This has highlighted the growing multipolarity in international relations, where alliances and influence are more fragmented and fluid than during the Cold War, complicating responses to crises like Crimea. In Europe, the invasion accelerated efforts to reduce dependency on Russian energy resources. The European Union began seeking alternative energy sources, and countries like Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states reassessed their energy security strategies. NATO, for its part, increased its military presence in Eastern Europe, conducting large-scale military exercises near Russia's borders as a show of strength. Poppelze, 2024, discusses how the Crimea situation has brought Ukraine closer to NATO, with joint military exercises, increased defense cooperation, and greater alignment with Western military standards. The human cost of annexation. While the geopolitical ramifications of Crimea's annexation are widely discussed, the human cost is often overlooked. The Crimean Tatars, a Turkic Muslim ethnic group with deep historical roots in the region, largely opposed the annexation. Following Russia's occupation, the Tatars faced widespread repression. Human rights organizations reported arrests, forced disappearances, and the closure of Tatar language media outlets. Many Tatars, who had already endured brutal deportations under Stalin, found themselves under threat once again, with their cultural and political voices increasingly silenced. Long-term consequences for Ukraine and Russia. The annexation of Crimea has had a profound impact on Ukraine's domestic and foreign policy. Faced with the loss of territory, Ukraine accelerated its efforts to align with the West, signing an association agreement with the EU and seeking military support from NATO. Beckley, 2022, notes that the crisis served as a wake-up call for Europe, reminding it of the importance of collective security against Russian aggression. For Russia, while the annexation boosted national pride and Putin's approval ratings, it came at a significant cost. The sanctions led to a decline in foreign investment, a drop in the ruble's value, and economic stagnation. Yet despite these challenges, Putin's government has remained defiant, framing the annexation as a necessary move to protect Russian sovereignty. A precedent for future conflicts, the invasion of Crimea has set a dangerous precedent in international relations. By redrawing borders through force, Russia has challenged the post-World War II order that emphasized the inviolability of sovereign state. This has implications for other regions with contested territories, raising fears of similar actions by other powers. The story of Crimea is far from over. As tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate, the events of 2014 serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of international peace. The Crimea invasion was not just about a piece of land. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for influence, and a bold statement by Russia against Western dominance. Whether you see it as a defensive measure by Russia or an aggressive act of expansion, the impact of Crimea's annexation will be felt for decades to come. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, one question remains: can the world learn from the lessons of Crimea, or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts on the Crimea invasion in the comments. Do you think Russia was justified, or was it a violation of international law? Let's discuss below.